Sarah Songorian for her special effort in getting this done. So today we are pleased to have with us a dear friend of SINe and one of the most important scholars in the field, not only of neuroethics, but of neuroscience and philosophy in general. You know, she would not need to be introduced. Adina Roskies, Dartmouth College, is one of the founders of neuroethics as a discipline, and she has kept making very important contributions to the field for many years. Today, she will be talking about the limits of neuroscience for ethics. Thank you very much, Adina, for this precious gift. And with great pleasure, I give you the floor.
Great, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and have a chance to have a little interaction with other human beings, which has been something that I've had very little of recently, and I think everyone feels the same way. So this is actually more of a philosophical and an ethical paper, and I'll try to go through slowly and explain things as I go along. I don't know whether there's a mechanism for people to ask questions in the middle of the talk or whether it's best to just wait until the discussion afterwards. So I'll let you guys, the organizers, be set the ground rules for that. Okay, so everybody can see my screen. And well, interestingly, I can't see. Hang on one second. I think I need to get out of that in order to, okay.
Oh.
All right.
Bonjour.
Hello. Okay, can everyone hear me? It's a little strange to do this because there's no feedback. All I see is my own slides and I can't see audience reaction at all. Okay, so yeah.
Sono Mario. I suggest to Sarah, turn off from your side the microphone so all participants, if someone forgets it, it gives problems.
Yeah, I'm muting them manually.
Yeah, okay. We can hear you well.
Okay, great. All right, so ethics is concerned with the normative or prescriptive, what we should do or value, what's morally permitted, compulsory or impermissible, what's morally right or wrong. Ethical guidelines are a framework for human interaction, both with other humans and with the natural world. In contrast, the natural sciences, including the brain sciences, aim to describe and explain the way the world is, and to provide us with understanding and tools we need to predict phenomena and to allow us to intervene on the world to make it the way we want it to be. The progress in the brain sciences over the last half-century has been nothing short of astounding. Although the brain does not give up its secrets easily, the pace of basic research and the development of new tools for investigating brain function are revolutionizing our understanding of the organ that makes us who we are, that supports belief and understanding, and that governs behavior. How are these two endeavors, brain science and ethics, related? From the above characterization of the prescriptive and the descriptive, you might think of these two projects as not being related at all. But I think to argue this would be to ignore certain trends in recent research. For example, neuroethics purports to be a melding of the descriptive neuroscientific program with the normative ethical one. It's been characterized by me, for example, as comprising the ethics of neuroscience and the neuroscience of ethics, both of which prima facie entail a blending. Okay, what's that? Both of which entail a blending of the two endeavors. So here, what I'm interested in is the neuroscience, the limits of neuroscience for ethics. And so I'll focus on this following question. What can neuroscience offer that can help us answer ethical questions? So first, how compelling is the claim that neuroscience and ethics are unrelated? The notion stems from the view that the gap between the normative and the descriptive is unbridgeable, the intuition expressed in Hume's famous dictum that one can't derive an ought from an is. So Hume writes, "In every system of morality which I've hitherto met with, I have always remarked that the author proceeds for some time in an ordinary way of reasoning and establishes the being of a god or makes observations concerning human affairs, when of a sudden I'm surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions, is and is not, I meet with no proposition that's not connected with an ought or an ought not. This change is imperceptible, but is, however, of the last consequence," which he means of the first consequence. "For as this ought or ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation, 'tis necessary that it should be observed and explained, and at the same time that a reason should be given for what seems altogether inconceivable. This new relation can be deduction from others which are entirely different from it." So I'm hearing stuff coming into me. Is that somebody trying to ask a question or?
No, Adina, I'm sorry. Some of them, when they enter the meeting, have the microphone on. So you will, I'm just muting them as they come in. I'm sorry about that.
I see. Okay. So this is Hume's diagnosis of this imperceptible shift from is to ought, and his claim that there's really no way of justification of how you can get from an is to an ought. So Hume's observation seems correct, but whether his point is a logical one or merely a trivial consequence of a distinctly sentimentalist view of morality, which is his own, has been hotly debated. Some have called the admonition that you can't derive an ought from an is Hume's law. Others believe it's neither a law nor true, and some suggest that even Hume himself didn't believe it. Yet if the purely descriptive cannot yield a prescriptive conclusion, and if neuroscience is purely descriptive, then it seems neuroscience alone cannot yield the truth of ethics. To think otherwise is to confuse is an ought. This is a contentious and subtle issue, but it can serve as a useful starting point for our discussion. One variant of this is-ought conflation is most frequently found in the religious ethical arguments. It involves sliding from a description of what's natural to what's morally right, or from the unnatural to the immoral. This is a common mode of argument in debates about sex and gender. There's not much of brain science in these debates, and when there is, what brain science tells us about is naturally occurring, such as the reported brain markers of homosexuality. So this type of argument is more difficult to harness for the desired ends. Instead, neuroscience methods are such that they may implicitly promote a move from normal to right. Clinical populations are identified and brain areas are measured and compared to matched controls. Statistical differences in the population measurements are postulated to be causally involved in the genesis of the clinical condition. The short step then to the idea that normal brains are the right kind of brains to have. Brains that are not normal are abnormal or wrong. While perhaps this is a reasonable approach to hypothesis formation regarding the neural basis of a phenotype, the risk is conflation of semantically ambiguous concepts. In most cases, normality, as far as brain science goes, is a statistical notion describing what falls around the mean of the distribution in a population. But the same word also has normative connotations. To deviate from the norm is to be deviant. To not be normal is to be abnormal. Both deviant and abnormal have negative connotations. The natural sciences description of what has in itself no normative content, and to license the negative inference, one would need a bridging premise such as the way things are so because a benevolent God made them so. Otherwise, deviation from the norm could instead be an improvement or normatively irrelevant. Recent work in experimental philosophy indicates that people's concepts of normality blends these descriptive and these normative aspects. In neuroscience, the argument for ethics from naturalness most often appears in the context of debates about the neuroscience of enhancement or other kinds of technological interventions. Improving the brain over what is natural is often thought to be morally problematic in virtue of its unnaturalness. But the argument is fallacious for reasons mentioned above. Neural enhancement or interventions more generally are not morally problematic simply because they alter the world order by unnatural means or by altering norms for the reasons outlined above. Additional normative premises must be accepted to reach these conclusions, and these normative premises did not emerge from science. In sum, many of the arguments from neuroscience to ethical conclusions trade on fallacious arguments that depend on conflating ambiguous terms or importing hidden normative premises that stem not from the neuroscience, but from religious or ideological conviction, bias, and other things. So does that mean that neuroscience cannot offer anything to ethics? In what follows, I discuss the limits of 3 ways in which I think neuroscience can contribute to ethics. So the first is in naturalizing normativity. The second is in yielding normative data. And the third that I'm going to talk about is addressing metaethical questions. So I'm going to switch the order here slightly. Okay, so naturalizing normativity from a neuroscience perspective. There's a long-standing debate among philosophers about whether normative facts can be reduced to non-normative facts, or whether they should be eliminated, or whether the normative is itself irreducible. Some philosophers and scientists intent on naturalizing ethics have claimed that a scientific approach to ethics can yield an entirely naturalized ethics. For example, Pat Churchland, in a book in 2012, argues that human morality is formed on a neurobiological scaffold that evolved long ago, originally to promote care of self and offspring, and was later co-opted to foster more sophisticated cooperative interactions. She hypothesizes that ethics is a 4-dimensional scheme for social behavior that is shaped by interlocking brain processes. Identifying these dimensions as caring, that's rooted in a biological attachment to kith and kin, the ability to recognize others' psychological states, or mind reading, problem solving in a social context, and social learning. Different brain networks contribute to each. Churchland implies that a proper understanding of the biological basis of human morality tells us all we need to know about the moral. The gulf between ought and is only apparent. But I think Churchland's biology-centered picture leaves open significant questions about the good and the right that require philosophical and not biological answers. For example, why is human flourishing the value upon which all others should be based? Suppose other intelligent creatures were to evolve whose conditions for flourishing conflicted with ours. Whose should have priority? And then even more fundamentally, is morality real? Is it relative, or is it illusory? The neuroscience of morality, along with the deliverances of other sciences, may ultimately account for the moral frameworks that we have, but one could argue not for whether those are the morally right ones to have. This is a version of Moore's open question argument. Moore famously argued that for any definition of the good, it's still open to us to ask whether that is indeed good. To think that the latter question is moot is to take a normative stance on metaethical questions. A different, perhaps more nuanced view recognizes the pull of these normative questions, but holds that a pluralist, pragmatist approach can nonetheless illuminate them. Flanagan and colleagues argue that ethics, like epistemology, has a descriptive side and a normative side, and that moral psychology and moral neuroscience can inform the former. The normative side is radically underdetermined by the merely descriptive, according to them, and it's mistaken to expect demonstrations of the normative from ethics, which instead proceeds, as it must, from inductive and abductive reasoning based on attention to certain practices, values, virtues, and principles. But according to these ethical naturalists, neuroscience is just one of an unlimited number of sources of information to weigh in ethical deliberation. For what they quote, what is relevant to ethical reflection is everything we know, everything we can bring to ethical conversation that merits attention, and thus holds no privileged relation to ethical thought. And if this is the case, the question we began with seems ill-posed, for it implied that neuroscience has some kind of privileged standing in regard to ethics. Can I just ask, when you guys see my screen, do you see my control bar in front of the slides, or you just see the slide?
Just the slide.
Okay, good, because It doesn't look like that to me. So excellent. Another thread one can see in the literature is to use neuroscience and moral psychology to describe how we actually reason ethically, and to argue that the right ethical theory is the one that best comports with actual human ethical reasoning. For example, Churchland and Casebeer, in an earlier work in 2003, described the brain machinery underlying ethical reasoning and behavior, and argue that rather than it being dedicated machinery for moral cognition and action, it's wide-ranging general-purpose cognitive machinery recruited for moral tasks. They then championed virtue ethics as the most plausible ethical theory on the grounds that developing and exercising the virtues involves wide-ranging general-purpose cognitive machinery rather than more domain-specific resources postulated by rationalists or sentimentalists. In order for this kind of inference to be compelling, one would have to accept certain assumptions. One assumption that would clearly license the inference from descriptive neuroscience about moral cognition to prescriptive theory is that the correct moral theory must be a theory that humans do implement. This assumption is a hard one to swallow, as it's clear at the very least that many humans, even those that lead our countries, fail to implement the correct moral theory. This we can infer purely on the basis of the existence of moral disagreement. Furthermore, widespread agreement about some moral wrongs and the undeniable fact that some people commit them also makes this assumption seem far too strong. A weaker naturalistic claim is that the correct moral theory must be a theory that humans can implement. This view is related to the dubious but often accepted view that ought implies can. In other words, the correct moral theory is such that given the capacities that humans have, it must be possible that the proper exercise of these would enable them to reason or act as morality dictates. If this is the case, it would not necessarily allow one to choose between rationalist or sentimentalist views or virtue theories. On the other hand, a naturalistic approach to ethics might explain the existence and exercise of various capacities in moral and social reasoning as evidence of their import to the correct moral theory. I suspect that something like this is the intuition driving Churchland and Casebeer's view. It does imply certain kinds of constructivist commitments about the metaphysics of morality that perhaps not all moral theorists would be willing to accept. For example, the view seems to imply that as an artifact of human evolution and culture, it's senseless to appeal to any moral standard outside of the one implicit already in our own behavior. It is possible, however, to reject both these assumptions and hold instead that a correct moral theory outlines an ideal which humans should strive to approximate, but it need not be one which we do or can implement. Indeed, if Christian ethics and some versions of Kantian ethics are of this, Christian ethics and some versions of Kantian ethics are of this ilk. If this is the case, arguments from psychology or brain science may hold little purchase for deciding among normative theories. Note, however, that this does not imply that moral theory floats free from human performance entirely, which one may think would be a reductio of the view. One could still hold what seems to be a foundational commitment of moral theorizing, that is, that our moral intuitions are an important guide to moral theory. However, since the bulk of our moral intuitions are accommodated by all the major contenders for more normative ethics, this view would not enable one to use moral neuroscience to argue for a particular moral theory. Nonetheless, some have claimed that neuroscience can do just that. So in the next section, we consider a body of work that some people have interpreted to show that descriptive neuroscience can yield normative conclusions. And you're all familiar with the trolley problem. I have put in Italian streetcars here to illustrate, just to make it seem like home. Okay, so does neuroscience yield normative data, or does it address ethical questions? So the most pointed debate emerged early in the attempts to use neuroscientific methods to study moral reasoning. That is the part of the neuroscience of ethics that, or the part of neuroethics that really focuses on the neuroscientific foundations of ethical reasoning. So In 2001, Joshua Green and colleagues published a landmark paper using neuroimaging to look at brain activity while subjects were presented with moral dilemmas and made judgments about whether a hypothetical action was appropriate or inappropriate. So basically, they took this famous trolley problem and scanned people while they were given trolley problem dilemmas. The trolley problem had been a phenomenon of fascination for philosophers. Why, given the scenario of a trolley hurtling down a track poised to hit 5 people, would most people say that it's permissible to flip a switch, and some people think that it's required to flip the switch to switch the trolley away from the 5 people to hit the 1 person on this other track, killing only 1 and saving the 5, whereas most of the same people claim it's impermissible to push someone into the path of the trolley, sacrificing the 1 to save the 5. So that's the footbridge case of the dilemma, right? So the trolley problem question is, why do people make different judgments about what's permissible to do in the case when in both cases what you're doing is saving 5 people by sacrificing 1? So Josh Green hypothesized that the factor that was responsible for people's different decisions in these 2 structurally similar scenarios was their differing emotional reactions to those situations. In moral scenarios in which the subject was directly involved in the action, which he called moral personal dilemmas, people would have a stronger emotional reaction than in moral dilemmas in which the effect was more distantly related to their action, which he called moral impersonal dilemmas. He scanned subjects using fMRI while they judged whether particular actions in moral personal and moral impersonal and even non-moral puzzle cases were appropriate or inappropriate. Green and colleagues found that, as hypothesized, brain areas typically involved in emotional processing were more active in the trials that were similar to the footbridge dilemma, in that the subject was up close and personally involved in the action. And these are the cases in which most subjects judged the action was inappropriate, than in the moral impersonal and non-moral cases. They also found that the cases in which subjects judged the action in the moral personal scenarios to be appropriate, the time it took for subjects to make that judgment was longer than in the cases when they judged it to be inappropriate. So in the very same cases, when they made judgments that it was appropriate, it took them, there was more cognitive processing involved than just having the reaction that it was inappropriate. So Josh Green and his colleagues hypothesized that this was due to interference effects, much as in the Stroop task, where it takes longer to name the color of a text of a color word when the color it named was incongruent with the color of that text than when it was congruent. And so what you see is that in the moral personal dilemmas, there's more activity in the brain areas that are emotional than in the cognitive, the brain in the areas in the cognitive areas are showing more activity in the moral impersonal dilemmas. So they found evidence for cognitive control in the cases in which the what they called the characteristically consequentialist judgments, utilitarian type judgments, prevailed over characteristically deontological ones. These and further fMRI results were interpreted as supporting what Green terms a dual process theory of moral judgment, in which both automatic and controlled systems respond to moral scenarios. Emotional reactions are an example of such automatic processes, and conscious deliberation and calculation are examples of controlled processes. So in the dual process framework, each system weighs in favor of a behavioral response, but sometimes these responses conflict. And so here you see this picture of the network of brain areas that, depending on which kind of dilemma you're faced with, may activate one of these dual processes more strongly than the other. And when they come into conflict, depending on the strength of the conflicting processes and the way in which this conflict monitoring occurs, you might get a judgment of appropriateness or inappropriateness. So this is essentially a sketch of what they postulate to be underlying the kinds of judgments that go on, the reasoning underlying the judgments that go on in the trolley problem type cases. In the 2001 paper, Josh Greene and his colleagues are quite clear that the lesson to be learned from the neuroscientific experiment is a psychological one and not a philosophical one, and that the results are descriptive and not normative. Our conclusion, therefore, this is their quote, is descriptive rather than prescriptive, so it couldn't be more clear, right? We do not claim to have shown any actions or judgments to be morally right or wrong, nor have we argued that emotional response is the sole determinant of judgments concerning moral dilemmas of the kind discussed in this study. And Greene and his colleagues are likewise circumspect about the importance of the personal-impersonal distinction. They say, we view this distinction as a useful first cut, an important but preliminary step toward identifying the psychologically essential features of circumstances that engage or fail to engage our emotions, and that ultimately shape our moral judgments. A distinction such as this may allow us to steer a middle course between the traditional rationalism and more recent emotivism that have dominated moral psychology. Again, they're explicit about their results being psychological and not philosophical. However, at the end of the paper, they close with an interesting question. How will a better understanding of the mechanisms that give rise to our moral judgments alter our attitudes towards the moral judgments we make? So although they are very clear that the conclusions that you can draw from their work are psychological conclusions and not philosophical conclusions, they sort of leave this dangler that suggests that there is a way to draw philosophical conclusions from the psychological data. In later work, Greene took aim at this interesting question, one that bridges between the descriptive understanding of the mechanisms of moral judgment and our own normative attitudes towards the judgments we make. In a series of papers culminating in one called Beyond Point-and-Shoot Morality, Why Cognitive Neuroscience Matters for Ethics, they present an extended argument for why the results of the fMRI experiments militate in favor of consequentialism rather than deontology. So it looks on the face of it that they're actually drawing philosophical and normative conclusions from the descriptive work of neuroscience. Dual process systems support both efficiency and flexibility for being able to rely on automatic systems when the stakes are low, speed matters, or problems that are easily solved save resources and sometimes lives if you're being chased by a tiger. However, being able to deploy controlled rational processes when the stakes are higher endows us with a much richer and more nuanced repertoire of behavior. Greene further suggests that characteristically deontological judgments, what he calls deontological judgments, are supported by the automatic system, while those that he names characteristically utilitarian rely upon controlled processes. So he's also careful to insist that the way that he terms them as characteristically deontological and utilitarian judgments are only technical categories that did not map cleanly onto the philosophical literature that bear those names. Greene argues we ought to privilege our rational over our emotional responses for a variety of reasons. We ought to distrust our intuitive emotional responses to these kinds of scenarios and privilege our controlled non-intuitive judgments, discounting the appropriateness of our characteristically deontological judgments and favoring the characteristically utilitarian one. Thus, he ultimately concludes that neuroscience can tell us something about ethics. Much ink has been spilled over the appropriateness of many of the distinctions employed in this research. So there's a series of papers, some very interesting ones with Salim Barker and Guy Kahane and Francis Cam. For example, several commentators criticize Greene's use of philosophical terminology, arguing that the positions he characterizes do not map accurately onto philosophical views. Cam, for instance, questions whether what he calls deontological judgments are due to the personal-impersonal factor rather than some other correlated factor, such as whether they're using people as a means. Arguably, some of these criticisms are appropriate, but many miss their mark, and some merely reiterate what Greene already recognizes and gives us caveats for. In fact, I mean, he's very explicit that what he calls characteristically deontological or characteristically utilitarian do not map cleanly onto philosophical positions. It's also worth noting that although many behavioral economists attribute irrationality to emotion, not all cognitive scientists are on board with privileging the rational over the emotional. For example, the heuristics and biases work of Gigerenzer and colleagues champions the role of emotion in decision-making. Rather than evaluating these criticisms, I want to focus here on the overarching question of whether neuroscience can say anything about ethics. Although the parties seem to disagree, a closer look reveals that they're on the same page about whether neuroscience alone can yield normative results. So many have interpreted Greene as trying to derive normative claims from descriptive science. However, as Cam notes, to discount emotional parts of the brain, one already has to have the view that emotion-engaging personal factors are irrelevant or a sense of what the right ethical answer is. And Greene agrees with that. He derives a normative conclusion from his dual process results by introducing a normative premise in his argument, and not one that emanates from the science. So in essence, his argument is the following. P1 says that characteristically deontological judgments are generated by emotional systems. P2, characteristically utilitarian judgments are generated by controlled reasoning systems. And this emerges from his work. But P3, the premise that our emotions are sensitive to factors that are not morally relevant, is itself a normative concept. And the judgments that certain features are or are not morally relevant are moral judgments. Although the bridge from what he calls characteristically deontological or utilitarian judgments to actual philosophical positions may be difficult to cross for reasons elucidated by Greene's critics, if he can fill in the intervening reasoning steps that allow us to conclude the conclusion, he's made a significant moral claim. But the arguments for P3 are not purely based on intuition, but also on plausible debunking arguments. On Greene's view, our deontological moral intuitions emerge from automatic processes. Relying on some plausible assumptions about the role of intuitions in moral disagreement and evolutionary history, Greene suggests that we should distrust our intuitions in cases of non-factually based moral disagreement, and that in those cases, we should rely more on the manual mode, referring to an analogy with camera settings that work well in most normal conditions on an automatic mode, but may need to be overridden with manual settings in unusual conditions. Greene is quite clear about the role of neuroscience in his reasoning. Such experiments identify factors to which our moral judgments are sensitive. This information may be combined with independent normative assumptions concerning the kinds of things to which our judgments ought to be sensitive. This combination can lead us to new substantive moral conclusions. In other words, scientific information can allow us to trade in difficult ought questions for easier ought questions. That is, that we can simplify the kinds of ought questions that we have, and therefore advance ethics. What's important is his view, in his view, is that different situations call for more weight on the automatic or on the manual settings, and that empirical evidence can tell us which is being preferentially used. Greene further clarifies that neuroscience does not play a special role in this type of argument. Many kinds of empirical inquiry can have a bearing on the types of mechanisms that are being used in moral reasoning. So in sum, despite the rancorous air of the debate, all those involved are in agreement about the inability of neuroscience to provide normative premises to moral arguments. What they seem to differ on is the degree to which the empirical results are reflective of actual philosophical positions and what counts as normatively significant or insignificant. Okay, so now I want to turn to the question of neuroscience and metaethics. So I've argued that if neuroscience can give us insight into the cognitive processes we use in order to make ethical judgments or to motivate ethical behavior, that knowledge may itself inform our understanding of ethics. Understanding ethics is itself a philosophical project that goes under the name of metaethics, the philosophical analysis of ethics. Metaethics focuses on what kind of activity ethical thought, talk, and behavior is, and metaethical work often tries to characterize ethics with claims about what might or must, what it might, must, or could not be. In order to illustrate the way in which neuroscience may impact metaethics, I'll take as an example a case in which neuroscience has been called upon to address the problem of motivational internalism, or how ethical belief or judgment is related to moral motivation. What connection, if any, is there between judging something to be morally required or prohibited, morally right or wrong, and moral behavior? We recognize that the pathway between thought and action is mediated by something, that something must impel one to act. We identify that state as motivation. What then is the relation between moral judgment and motivation to act? Some metaethical theories entail that moral judgment entails motivation. For example, if moral judgment just is a species of emotion, and emotion is by its nature motivational, there would be an entailment between moral judgment and motivation. If morality were rationally required, and moral judgments played the role of premises in a practical syllogism, one might argue that moral motivation is required on pain of irrationality, like Michael Smith does. The claim that moral motivation is somehow intrinsic to moral judgment is called motivational internalism, and one formulation of that claim that I've called substantive motivational internalism is the following, and this is MI. If an agent judges that it's right to phi in circumstances C, then he's motivated to phi in circumstances C. MI is formulated in modal terms. The link postulated between moral judgment and motivation is one of necessity. If the connection is necessary, then it's not possible for one to judge that it's right to phi, but not be motivated to phi. Various arguments have been marshaled for and against MI. One of the most influential is the argument from conceivability. The amoralist is a person who understands morality and has moral beliefs, but is unmotivated by them. The example of the amoralist is that it's conceivable that someone may judge some action to be right or wrong, yet not care about morality and thus not be motivated to act in concert with his moral judgment. So this argument stems from David Brink's work. But the argument always seems to get bogged down in a discussion of whether this is indeed conceivable or whether conceivability is a guide to possibility. Unsurprisingly, those who already held that MI was true argued that the amoralist is not a real possibility. Either he's motivated or he doesn't really make moral judgments. Micah, sorry, you've got to go. Micah, you have to leave, sorry. Sorry, guys. So I introduced to the discussion a class of real patients with damage to ventromedial frontal cortex. So here's a picture of Phineas Gage, who's supposed to be, nope, it's supposed to be rotating so you can see the tamping iron that goes through his head and obliterates his ventromedial frontal cortex, and he is the famous poster child of this kind of brain damage, deficit caused by this brain damage, but he's not the only one. And case studies show that patients with damage to ventromedial cortex are able to make moral judgments that are in line with those of normal people, yet they often fail to act in ways consistent with those judgments. Although the kinds of moral failings they exhibit are not extreme, like a failure to keep promises, lying, acting irresponsibly, it bears noting that these people were upstanding citizens prior to their brain damage, which happened relatively late in life. When people sustain damage to the same region in childhood, they in contrast show much more extreme immoral behavior and seem to be unable to even learn the moral norms that are unproblematic to the late damaged subjects. So I've argued that the VM patients are walking counterexamples to motivational internalism, to MI, in that they make normal moral judgments and they seem to retain declarative knowledge, but do not seem to be motivated to act in accord with those judgments. So they are at least a proof of possibility by being actual of the dissociation between moral belief and judgment and moral motivation. In addition, I adduce evidence that they fail to show skin conductance responses when faced with moral situations, whereas normal people regularly exhibit them. And I take these skin conduction responses to be evidence of motivation, which is a species of arousal, and their absence to be evidence of absence of motivation. So I think VM patients are not motivated to FI in circumstances C, despite making normal moral judgments and having normal moral beliefs, falsifying motivational internalism. So what makes this case importantly different from Brink's amoralist is that the ventrimutal patients are actual people and thus not susceptible to the counter-argument that amoralists are inconceivable or impossible. As such, their existence also constrains the possible stories one might give to support or discount the relevance of that debate. For example, Cholby argues that these people lack moral beliefs, and I argue that that's implausible. They make normal moral judgments that are equivalent to those that normal subjects make. They use moral terms normally, and so on. How could this behavior remain if they failed to retain moral knowledge and have moral belief? One would not deny a newly blind person with retinal damage the understanding of what red means or the ability to believe that stop signs are red, even if they can no longer perceive red. The reality of these patients requires that we treat them as actual people and take seriously their embeddedness in the world. Do ventrimutal patients disprove MI? So some people think so, and others argue that they don't for various reasons. Some claim that ventrimutal patients are motivated by their moral judgments and deny that the SCR, the skin conductance response, is diagnostic of motivation. While this is possible, it seems as if the question of whether these people are motivated is ultimately an empirical one that adequate understanding of the neural basis of motivation might address. Others deny that the moral judgments these people appear to make are really moral judgments. They're merely moral judgments in scare quotes, where the scare quotes here indicate that they just seem like moral judgments or are the parroting of what the person thinks others would say. But these people then need to make the case for why this is the best explanation of the profile of the VM patients, and to do so without relying on internalism as a reason on pain of begging the question. So ultimately, I think it's inference to the best explanation that will win the day. And I would argue that the best explanation of the constellation of features exhibited by VM patients is the falsity of motivational internalism, and not some convoluted explanation for why these people fail to understand their words or do not really believe what they avow. The actual existence of these patients concretizes and constrains some of the arguments that can give in for or against motivational internalism, but the fact that these alternative explanations exist illustrate the limits of neuroscience for philosophy. The addition of neuroscientific evidence is not going to yield a demonstrative and incontrovertible answer to a deep philosophical question. These are, after all, deep philosophical questions in part because of how intertwined our concepts and theories are with one another, and there are always many moving parts. Neuroscientific data and empirical argument can change the balance of the debate, though, lending weight to one side or another such that the judgments of which explanation is superior may perceptibly shift. All right, so I guess the question is then, if, as I've argued, you can't really derive an ought from an is, how can neuroscience help ethics, or what can neuroscience do? Earlier, I argued that neuroscience is fundamentally a descriptive enterprise and ethics a normative one. And many people endorse Hume's dictum that you cannot derive normative claims from purely descriptive ones. This would seem to tightly hamstring neuroscience's ability to tell us anything important about ethics. But I think this conclusion would be too hasty. Although one cannot derive a normative claim from purely descriptive claims, many normative arguments rely heavily on factual premises. For example, consider the plausible moral claim that human consciousness is morally significant and that anyone who is conscious is due moral consideration or is a moral patient. One might further think that absence of awareness and absence prospect for regaining awareness, one might disqualify someone from full moral consideration. Well, who is conscious? We may think this is an easy question, for certainly you and I are, though philosophers have pointed out that we have demonstrative reason to believe this only of ourselves. But every year, thousands of people undergo some kind of traumatic brain injury that leaves them behaviorally unresponsive to all kinds of stimulation. In this country alone, there are anywhere from 14,000 to 35,000 people, this is kind of inferred, who have been diagnosed as being in a persistent vegetative state, or PVS, who, while not devoid of brain activity, nonetheless show no signs of responsiveness to stimulation. Excuse me for 1 second while I close the door. Okay, so there's something between 14,000 and 35,000 people who are diagnosed with PVS. They show no signs of responsiveness to stimulation, no response to pain, no awareness of self or environment. These patients have been classified as lacking consciousness, and their moral standing is in question. They're still living humans, but often on life support and usually without realistic prospects of recovery. So this was the state of affairs until 2006, when Adrian Owen and colleagues conducted a landmark study. They put a PVS patient who had been unresponsive for 5 years into an MRI scanner and instructed the patient, who they had no reason to expect could hear or understand their instructions, to perform one of two mental imagery tasks. The first task was to imagine playing tennis, a task they knew in normal people characteristically activated brain regions such as the SMA. Then they instructed her to perform the other mental imagery task. This time was navigating through one's home environment. This task activated a different constellation of brain areas in normal subjects. Imagine the shock when they found that the patterns of brain activation they observed in the PVS patient were indistinguishable from the patterns found in the normal subjects. This was a patient that was deemed unconscious or not conscious, unresponsive, with massive brain trauma. But to perform the task, the patient must have heard the instructions, understood the instructions, retained sufficient executive resources to coordinate a response, retained enough motivational resources to carry out a response for an extended period of time on the order of minutes, which is what it requires to do these brain scans, must have performed the requested mental imagery tasks, acted, I think, voluntarily, and maintained attentional focus for the duration. There's little evidence that automatic processes are sustained in this way. So while we can only infer that the patient was conscious to perform these tasks, it's not clear what we would mean by consciousness that would include all these elements yet fail to be conscious, or what value this type of consciousness would have. The upshot of this experiment was powerful evidence that the patient they had been diagnosed as not conscious, and by all behavioral criteria justifiably so, but was much more cognitively intact than anyone had suspected. Further studies on a small cohort of PVS patients revealed that approximately 17% of these patients were able to do the mental imagery tasks. If that is representative of the population, it would suggest that somewhere between 2,500 and 6,000 people who are currently deemed so severely brain damaged that they are not aware of themselves or their environment are in fact relatively cognitively intact. The relevant point here is that without the data provided by these neuroscience experiments, we would not have had any evidence that these patients have any mental life at all. And although we might value human consciousness, we would not have had reason to include these patients in our moral deliberations. So the addition of a fact derived from neuroscience changes the reasoning from what I show here as argument A to argument B. So here, argument A has premise 1, only conscious human organisms should be accorded full moral consideration. Premise 2, PVS patients show no sign of voluntary behavior or of awareness or responsiveness to the environment for extended periods of time. And premise 3, consciousness is evidenced by some kind of volition, awareness, and or responsiveness to the environment. So you can conclude from that, C1, PVS patients are not conscious, and therefore C2, PVS patients should not be accorded full moral consideration. And here what you have is P1 is a normative philosophical thesis, P2 and 3 are factual claims, and C1 follows from P2 and P3, and C2, a normative claim, follows from all 3 claims. from P1 and C1. So that's what you get before you do these neuroscience experiments. But then after you've done these neuroscientific experiments and added a factual premise, you get argument B. So you have P1, again, only conscious human organisms should be accorded full moral consideration. P2, PVS patients show no external signs of voluntary behavior or awareness or responsiveness to the environment for extended periods of time. P3, consciousness is evidenced by some kind of volition, awareness, or responsiveness to the environment. And now P4, some PVS patients show internal signs of voluntary behavior and awareness that are evidenced by predictive patterns of neural activity. And here you get C1, at least some PVS patients are conscious, which is not what you got in the previous argument. And then you get the C2, at least some PVS patients should be accorded full moral consideration. So in this case, P1 is a normative philosophical thesis, P2 and P3 are factual claims, and P4 is an additional descriptive claim derived from neuroscientific experiments. C1 follows from P2, P3, P4, and C2. A very different normative conclusion from that in argument A follows from P1 and C1. Thus, the conclusion of the argument, which is an ethical claim, is radically affected by the addition of a purely descriptive premise. Facts play a very important role in moral reasoning. This idea is not new. It was a key point in Greene's early work, as he said, science does matter for ethics, not because one can derive moral truths from scientific truths, but because scientific information can challenge factual assumptions on which moral thinking implicitly depends. So, I think although the upshot of this paper is that science does not obviate philosophical reasoning or stand in for normative premises, I suspect that most of what neuroscience can contribute to ethics is of this genre, that is, that it adds factual premises that are normatively significant. So descriptive facts play a very important role in moral reasoning, and this is Greene's quote. And I suspect really that it's the addition of these factually but normatively significant premises that is what neuroscience really can contribute. So if the question is what does neuroscience have to offer for ethics, I think the answer to the question is quite a bit, provided that the neuroscientific results hook up in the right way with the ethical premises of an argument. And I thank you all for your attention, and I'm open for questions or discussion or however it is that we proceed.
Thank you very much, Adina, for this very, very interesting and insightful talk. And as you know, now we'll have two discussants, namely Professor Mario De Caro and Professor Massimo Reichling. Mario is at Roma Tre University and Tufts University. Massimo is at Vita e Salute San Raffaele University. Both are SINe board members and renowned philosophers interested in cognitive science and involved in the neuroethics field. Please, Mario.
Yeah, thank you very much, Adina. That was very clear, very useful, as usual, with your stuff. I have only a couple of comments. The first one that there is this big debate about what kind of naturalism we should endorse. And I think you are going clearly in the direction of a pluralistic or liberal naturalism, where you need different, in order to account for the world, different methods and different epistemological tools, and perhaps also some kind of ontological pluralism about properties. So really kind of liberal naturalism. That is coming from you, that you are an expert in neuroscience, it's a very healthy, I think. And you know, philosophers who are anti-reductionist generally are bullied by scientists. I remember Stephen Hawking writing that philosophy is useless, and then he actually, if for everyone interested in that, should read the destructive review of Tim Crane of Stephen Hawking book, where he, you know, just makes fun of Hawking's philosophical views. Anyway, one point that is interesting, I think extremely interesting, what you said, I agree with your point about metaethics. I have a question about your point about normative ethics. When you say that, you know, there is this weak naturalistic view according to which ought should imply can, that's the view. So a moral theory must be a theory that humans can implement. And that you say that's dubious. Because you could, and then you add, because one could say, as Christians perhaps do, and perhaps even Kantians sometime, or frequently, perhaps Kant himself, the idea that a correct moral theory just outlines an ideal which humans should strive to approximate, but it need not be one which we can do or can implement. Now, I'm curious about this notion of approximation. First, because, you know, there can be ethics that we physiologically or mentally simply cannot approximate. And this is an empirical question. I think we have the endowment to approximate all moral theories. If there are some that we can't, that seems to be an empirical question that can be answered by some natural sciences, perhaps. And also there is more. Approximation is a complex notion. For example, in philosophy of science, right? There is this huge debate about approximation to truth, and that's discussed. There are metrics of approximation and blah, blah, blah. But so we can have two moral theories. And they, you know, one way of adjudicating which is the best could be by discussing which is more approximable by us. That could be an interesting point. One could say, oh, come on, my theory is such that you can approximate it very much. Yours can only be approximated by saints. What's the best theory here? That seems to be an interesting point, I think, in which, you know, not only neuroscience, but a lot of scientific and perhaps even common sense knowledge could be implied. So goes in the direction, of course, not to prove that neuroscience or science in general are such that morality can be reduced to them, but they can be informative also for normative ethics beside. You have some points about that, but I would ask you to say a little more. And then some word about an issue you are very interested about, free will there. Not so much in neuroscience, but in cognitive science, there are these people like Wagner or Johansson that say that, you know, we are never really conscious of why we choose, the way we choose. In that sense, there is never a free choice because our choices don't depend on our conscious deliberations. These are only post hoc. We postulate that they exist, but they don't have any causal powers, our conscious deliberations. In this way, it seems that, you know, the vast majority of free will theories go bananas. I don't think that these theories are true, but they present a challenge that is an empirical challenge and is interesting. If these theories are true, if it's true that we cannot consciously decide ever, it means that we don't have free will. And so most of the moral theories depend on some kind of free will. So this could be another challenge that comes from empirical studies. So these were my two questions, if they are two.
Thank you very much, Mario.
Yes.
And now, Massimo, it's up to you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Adina, for your brief paper. And I have to say that perhaps I'm very sympathetic to you, to most of what you said, or perhaps to everything that you said. Still, I have some comments. The first point is something on which Mario has already commented on, so I will be very brief. If I got you right, you presented three possibilities for a normative theory, for the relationship between a normative theory and what we might say the psychological hardware in human beings. The first is that a theory should be limited, a normative theory should be limited to what humans basically are. So a theory that humans do in fact implement. And the second position was the idea that a theory must be something that humans can implement. And the third one is the idea on which Mario was commenting, the fact that the theory may be just the outline of an ideal, and you should strive to approximate the ideal, but it is not something which we do or can implement. And you offer Christian ethics and Kantian ethics as examples of this third option. It seems to me that this third option is a bit implausible, or perhaps a bit more less plausible than the other two, and I'm not sure that either Christian or Kantian ethics can be framed within this option. After all, the dictum "ought implies can" is in fact a Kantian slogan. So the assumption, I think, should be that from a Kantian viewpoint, that we can be entirely rational as Kantians would want us to be, even though we often don't, we are not entirely rational. And the same goes also for Christian ethics, perhaps, because also in Christian ethics, it is assumed that we can be unconditionally loving to our neighbor, for example, even though perhaps we rarely do that, but we can. So I think this, you say it is dubious, the dictum ought implies can is dubious, though often accepted. I guess it deserves, this point deserves a more thorough analysis. And my second point, I guess I have 3 points. My second point, or 3 or 4, my second point has to do with what you say about the attempt by Green and others to derive normative conclusions from neuroscience, and I think you're perfectly right on that. And the basic idea, and I very much agree with that, is that there is a normative premise in what, for example, Green says. And I would add to your sort of criticism, or perhaps it was not a criticism, just to show that even Green accepts the view that you cannot directly derive normative ethics from neuroscience. But I would also say, in a more critical vein, that sometimes it seems to me, I'm not sure, but maybe it is your, you can say something about this. It seems to me that sometimes there is a slip between what he calls the characteristically deontological mode of making moral judgments on the one side, which is a psychological construction in a sense, and the deontological theory on the other hand. It seems to me that the two are not clearly distinguished at all times, because the fact, if it is a fact, that those deontological judgments, for example, in trolley problem cases, are often or even always driven by emotional automatic reactions, does not show that they are wrong. For example, the fact that Green says that people no longer say that it is wrong to kill the fat man if you don't have to push him by yourself, but if you just push a button that makes him fall down. The fact that the people differ when these two situations give different judgments when these two different situations are presented, which are more or less similar, but for the fact that the first and not the second raises these emotional concerns. This has no bearing, in my view, on the normative question. Because the normative question, the deontologist would want to say that in both cases, for example, you are using the fat man merely as a means, or you are directly violating that man's right to life, or also other elements which are not the emotional factors, such as, for example, redirecting an existing threat versus introducing a new threat. Well, these elements are appropriate, according to the deontologist, even though they are not the reasons why people give their judgments, or even if the people give their judgments merely for those emotive reasons. So if we distinguished with much clarity the descriptive viewpoint from the prescriptive or normative one, I guess that we better see that, in a sense, there is, in the conclusion by Green and others, there is a sort of presupposition that only, which is a normative one, of course, that only consequentialist features are morally relevant. And to come to my perhaps third, perhaps last comment, I want to say something about the point on metaethics that you discussed. I agree with you that this example that you discussed, and you have already discussed in some of your papers, is an important and very useful help for moral theory. Discussing the case of VM patients is interesting because, as you say, we are basing ourselves and our metaethical discussions on facts and not on merely conceivable psychological conditions. However, as you yourself say, this fact does not eliminate the need for interpretation. And that is, you don't have, as you yourself have shown, you don't have an unconditionally clear answer on, for example, the problem of motivational internalism when you consider VM patients. Because, as you have mentioned, there are different possible interpretations. And now I want to discuss in very few words, I want to discuss the interpretation that you've offered. You have mentioned Smith's formulation of motivational internalism in the moral problem. And he says, more or less, that the theory, motivational internalism, defends the view according to which once you hold an ethical judgment, for example, P, either you are motivated to act on P or you are irrational. Mm-hmm. And this is more or less the formulation given by Smith. Now, I want to suggest that this objection to your conclusions. So long as VM patients are, in fact, sick people, that is, are people who have an ascertainable and very severe neurological disease, then can't we say that they are somehow or perhaps necessarily irrational? That is, that they lack an element of human rationality, which is peculiarly important for any social behavior, including, of course, moral behavior. They lack the intelligence of others' emotions and all that stuff, which is important for moral behavior. So is it not natural that they are not motivated? They are irrational to the extent that they are not motivated by those judgments. So would not this reading confirm rather than disprove motivational internalism? And my very last point is a suggestion of a different, and I just want you to comment on this, on a different contribution that may come from neuroscience in metaethics. I have a feeling that perhaps the metaethical issue on which neuroscience, and of course not only neuroscience, but moral psychology as well, and other empirical sciences as well, has more to say, is perhaps the metaethical debate concerning the divide between rationalism and sentimentalism. What the empirical studies show, it seems to me, is that whoever is right in reference to the interpretation of trolleys and other stuff, emotions do play an important role, both in the acquisition of moral capacity, as you already mentioned, the data on children with intermedial damage, and also in the making of moral distinctions and judgments. Therefore, it seems that these data cast doubt, at least on some forms of hyper-rationalistic theories, such as perhaps some forms of Kantian ethics. And this is perhaps the best, one of the most important contribution that neuroscience can give to metaethics, even though also in this case, you don't have, of course, any clear conclusion as to what is the right theory, which comes from neuroscience. But as you say, and I'm come to my conclusion, as you say in your paper, it seems that neuroscience can give reasons or can give some weight to some of the reasons in favor, for example, of a mildly sentimentalistic or perhaps a moderately rationalistic view of ethics versus radically rationalistic ones. And this, of course, is not everything that there is to say about moral theory, but it is much more than nothing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Massimo. I think Adina would like to briefly respond to this comment before we can get questions from the audience. In order to make a questions, you are kindly requested to write the word question in the chat window, and Sarah, our chairperson, will use a chronological order. So hurry up, and now please, Adina.
Okay, thank you for your comments, you guys. Maybe I'll start with Massimo's because it's more fresh in my mind, and then I'll return to Mario. Okay, with regard to your first point, the question of whether the relation between normative theory and psychology, well, I did ask the question of what is the relation? Does our normative theory have to be something that we do implement, or we can implement, or something that's just a goal and something that we can aim for, even if we can't approximate, or even if we can't really get there, although we may be able to approximate it. Now, I mean, the reason that I introduced these is because they give you different, the empirical will give you a different purchase on what ethics is. If you know that whatever your ethical theory is something that we do implement, then figuring out how we implement our theories can constrain what the right normative theory is. Whereas if it's merely something that we can strive for, but possibly not ever achieve, then knowing what it is that allows us to act or judge morally will put much fewer constraints on what the right normative theory is. Now, Massimo, I'm not going, I don't want to at all impugn or characterize Kantian or Christian ethics and say that, you know, those theories imply that we cannot achieve them. I don't want to take a stand on that, but I really wanted to just illustrate the point that not all ethical theories require that we do or even can implement them, and to the extent that they aren't necessarily achievable by us, you know, depending on what you think the relation is between normative theory and our abilities, you will get more or less information about correct normative theory by understanding empirically moral psychology. And whether or not the ought implies can is or is not dubious. I think, again, that's not something that I have strong views about, but it seems to me at least arguably plausible that the correct ethical theory, you know, if you could take a God's eye view, that it may be something that humans just aren't built to be able to do in its, you know, in all its perfection. Now, you know, those kind of commitments are philosophical commitments about, you know, the true morality that I don't think that they come from outside of any kind of neuroscientific stricture, right? I mean, these are really deep philosophical questions, and you could plausibly take very different views on them. And I don't think that those views are informed by neuroscience. I think that depending on what your view is, you will have a different picture of how neuroscience can inform ethical thought. And so that was really what I wanted to point out. Now, let me just go to something that Mario said, because it ties in here. So this notion of what it is to approximate a theory. Yeah, I think, first of all, there are going to be different kind of metrics for what it is to approximate a moral theory. So you might think that what is required is that the behavior approximate the behavior that the normative theory requires. But you might have, you know, like a more Kantian view is that what you have to approximate are the right kind of internal processes. And I don't know that there's some kind of objective way to adjudicate what the correct measure of approximation is. But given that you have agreed upon some measure of what approximation is, then if you think that what is more approximable is a better ethical theory, then that is an empirical question, right? You can presumably empirically study what it is that humans can approximate. I don't see any reason to necessarily think that that's a measure of a good theory, right? it is the less strong your ethical theory, the more a human is going to be able to approximate it, right? So
use as an argument, right? Saying, and it's used as an argument. Kant ethics interpreted not necessarily correctly, but as something that is, unreachable sometime, or some, very strict religious ethics. These are unreachable, people say. So we should think about, and so people saying, look, we should have a much more feasible ethic. Feasible, why? Because we can approach it from, because the way we are endowed.
Yeah, so you could have a Trumpian ethics and everybody could approximate that, and is that ethics, right? So
no, I'm not saying that is a winning argument. I'm saying that could be used.
I agree, but I think basically I think all of those things are themselves philosophical commitments that are not derivable from neuroscience, right? So once you make these philosophical commitments, then that will sort of give you information about how much the empirical stuff can inform your ethics. But I think fundamentally those are philosophical commitments, and they're not going to be commitments that are guided by neuroscientific discovery. So, I mean, I think we're in agreement. I think you could use approximation as some kind of virtue that, the more approximable a theory is, the more likely it is to be the correct moral theory. But I think that also entails that you're going to favor weaker ethical theories over stronger ones because they're going to be easier to approximate. And at some point, it seems to me that it's a, reductio of what morality, what ethics is, or what the good and the right are, right? So that's, I don't think we're in disagreement. I think that's just a clarification. So going back to Massimo's point, your criticism of Green that there's a slip between what he calls characteristically deontological and philosophical theories, I think that's true. I mean, I think that when he's being careful, he's clear to say that he doesn't mean for there to be a one-to-one mapping. On the other hand, it's not an accident that he called them what he called them. And, you might, in a counterfactual world where he just called them theory 1 and theory 2, you would, I think, imagine that the work he had done would get a lot less attention, right? And so there's definitely rhetorical payoff for calling things the names that he called them. Sorry, guys. So I think that the names and the slip buy him philosophical interest, and maybe that's good and maybe that's bad. I won't really weigh in on that. I think that you are correct that you can't infer that anything that's driven by emotion is therefore necessarily wrong. And so I agree that the argument he gives where he says, look, we should privilege the rational over the emotional, is importing a normative premise. And I don't see any reason to accept that premise. Although, well, I shouldn't say I don't see any reason. I think he tries to offer reasons, independent reasons to accept the premise, but I don't find them compelling. So I agree. I think that there's, no reason to think that emotion is in a less privileged state with respect to ethical judgment than rationality is. And so I think we can just have different take-home messages. What I think is often misunderstood is that sorry, I'm a little distracted because that was my dad and now he's calling on the other phone, so I'm hoping nothing is wrong. So I think that the point is that that there's no ethical take-home message without buying a normative premise, and the normative premise doesn't come from the neuroscience, right? So that was really the point that I want to make. I don't think that Greene disputes it, but his work, in a sense, tries to do the other thing. It's just that he recognizes that he's importing the normative premise. He tries to sort of hide it under the rug. With respect to the metaethics question, I certainly agree. I think in my original paper, I agree that you can accept Michael Smith's characterization of what motivational internalism is, and nothing I say contradicts it, right? You can accept that either the VM patients are motivated or they're practically irrational, but what I do say is that that's sort of tautological, right? Then whoever's not motivated is just by definition practically irrational, and I find that kind of an unhelpful way of characterizing things. So unless you have an independent way of identifying practical irrationality, you're not telling me anything more. And the case was really not so much identified as an argument against Michael Smith's version, but an argument against this very strong version of motivational internalism that I characterized. So yeah, I think you could just say these people are practically irrational, but you could also call them something else. And unless I have some kind of independent way of identifying it, I don't feel like I'm any further along in understanding metaethical questions. And then your last suggestion that rationalism and sentimentalism, the distinction between them is something that neuroscience can contribute to. I definitely think that that's true, but I don't think it's quite as straightforward as you might think, because so if you thought that identifying what parts of the brain are emotional parts and what parts of the brain are rational parts is a straightforward thing, then you could see what do we do when we make these decisions. But I think that even the distinction between emotion and cognition is not a straightforward one, and maybe a false dichotomy. And the only way in which we are able to identify the functional roles of brain areas is by looking at how they map onto behaviors. And so I think these questions of what counts as rational versus emotional, in order to settle the rationalist versus sentimentalist question, is itself not a straightforward, or even maybe not even a philosophically correct distinction to make. And so again, like every other philosophical question that I think I've discussed, there are lots of moving pieces and lots of interdependencies, and only by making some commitments that we may not have empirical license to make are we then allowed to make these other commitments. And so everything is I think fairly complicated even in that realm. But given that we have reason to identify certain brain areas as being specialized for emotion versus reason, yes, then we can use neuroscience to inform that question. Okay, so then going back to Mario, I think I talked about the implies can. The free will question. So yeah, if we're not conscious of why we make certain decisions, then if we lack free will, doesn't that impugn ethics? I I guess in theory, yes. However, I think that our the philosophical basis for which we think consciousness is necessary for ethical judgment, behavior, etc., is, I think, not clearly laid out. I don't think that I don't think that anyone has been very clear on exactly what it is about consciousness that's required for what sorts of free behaviors, etc. And I also think that it's not entirely, at least not agreed upon, the extent to which free will is a requirement for ethical thought, judgment, action, etc. So I think all of those things are, all of those links require substantiation. But furthermore, I think that the work that says that we do not act freely is completely wrong-headed. So the fundamental assumption I dispute, right? That I think we do often act freely, and the neuroscientific work that has been taken to show that we don't is flawed, or the interpretations are flawed. And so the presupposition I reject. So that brings us to liberal naturalism. And although we have a famous paper on that, has a
line every year.
Yes, one or two paragraphs written at this point. I have to say, I must be a liberal naturalist, but I don't know, I still don't really understand what it is to be a liberal naturalist. So that's when I'll have to turn it over to you to be more clear about what it is that I'm committing myself to. But anyway, I thank you all for your comments, and it was fun.
Thank you, Adina.
Thank you very much, Adina. And now I think we have time just for one or two questions.
Yeah, so the first one in line is Karsten Stuben. So Karsten, if you want to show yourself and or only open the mic, whatever you prefer.
Okay, hi. Great talk and great comments. And I guess my question continues some of the discussion, and I want to particularly focus on Green. And it seems to me you give him a way too an easy pass out. I mean, I agree that he enters a normative premise, and then he points to certain kind of factual claims about emotions being morally pointing towards morally irrelevant aspects of the world, etc., etc., and therefore we should use reason. And reason then somehow, out of the blue, magically is utilitarianism. So the argument, the conclusion that he makes for utilitarianism actually depends on a philosophically very sloppy characterization of deontology. And so that's not the way you should use neuroscience when you do philosophy, it seems to me. That is, I mean, all this claim that utilitarianism can incorporate values of dignities of humanity and the dignity of rational personhood, etc., that actually you don't find in utilitarianism, but it comes from the Kantian tradition, which emphasizes reason and rational agency and stuff like that. So yes, I mean, even if Green acknowledges philosophically sloppiness, great. That doesn't excuse his bad argument for utilitarianism, because it depends on a really, really bad characterization of Kantian deontology. And I mean, whenever I read it, I become very emotional about it. But I mean, that's inexcusable. I mean, that's kind of, I mean, that's not the way you should contribute to philosophical utilitarianism. I mean, so yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
I don't know that I want to say anything. I agree. I take that to be not the neuroscientific contribution that he made. And yeah, I don't want to defend the way, again, I said, if he had just called his theory something else by some other name that was not already known in philosophical literature, we would have a very different take on what he did, right?
Would it be so interesting then?
Well, right. So what he did for a reason, and it paid off in a way, but it did muddy the waters philosophically because of the close relationship between the names of whatever it is that he was theorizing and standard philosophical positions, right? So I don't disagree that in future attempts to marry neuroscience and philosophy, we should be more careful in the way in which we characterize our positions and their relation to other well-known positions. I take that to be a well-founded criticism. Yeah, I think my defense of him is only that he is well aware. And he admits it. So you might say, that, well, if he's well aware and he admits it, he shouldn't have done it. Or you could say, look, he's not pulling the wool over anyone's eyes. He's being straightforward about, a lack of clarity of the relationship between his names and positions and the ones in the philosophical literature. But yeah.
I guess he's not a deontologist. He's doing it for marketing purposes.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks.
Sarah?
So thank you very much. No, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone, to Karsten and Massimo and Mario for their comments. It was a really nice discussion, and the paper, of course, was beautiful. I just wanted to say that. So I think we're running out of time. So I've got a few people that have wrote me their questions. So Adina, I might send them to you.
Okay.
Would that be okay? Yeah? Okay, great.
Yeah. So you don't have, okay, I thought we were going to take at least one other question, but.
Okay, we can. Okay, so Andrea is in line. Can you open the mic, even though you cannot show yourself? I'm sorry, it's just Andrea. So there are a lot of Andreas, but the Andrea that wrote me might be able to open his mic. I don't think he can.
Okay.
So I'll ask him to send me a written version of the question, and I'll send it to you. Okay.
Okay. All right. That sounds good.
Thank you. So Andrea Lavazza this time.
Okay. Okay. Thanks once again, Adina. Thank you all very much. I think it was a very nice, interesting seminar. And now we'll have a very, very brief break, just a couple of minutes, 2 minutes, and then SINe assembly will start in Italian this time, for SINe members, obviously, and for those people who are interested in SINe activities. Thanks once again, and see you in a couple of minutes.
Okay.
Thank you, Adina.
Thank you, Adina.
My pleasure, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Yeah.
Now I can see.